Welcome back to mobile programming. In this session, we want to add some interactivity to our React component. So first and foremost, let us start up the server. So npm run dev. Our server is up and running. So let's grab the URL and let's navigate to that page. So this is our component, and you should have reached here in terms of your setup. Now, if we click on the buttons, please note that nothing happens. And that's why we want to add the interactivity. So let's go to the component page, show me that TSX, and let's start writing some codes. So as a first step, we want to wire up the interactivity so that we can get things moving whenever we click on one of these buttons. So I'm going to target the first button, which says set me. So it's this button here on the page. And we're going to put in some code so that we can at least say a basic message being displayed on the screen. So that's step one. How do we add the interactivity? Well, this is known as event handling or event programming. And an event is some action that the computer system can react to. In this case, we're talking about a button. So we have to figure out what kind of event, what kind of actions can the button respond to or react to. And there are a few, but the most common one is going to be the click event. If we go into the button, we can type on, and if you look at what is displayed on the screen, you're seeing a list of events that we can use. So the one that we are concerned about now is the event called onClick. And it's going to be onClick equal, and we are going to use our squiggly so that we can add our JavaScript code. Now the question is, what kind of JavaScript code do we put here? Well, we are going to place a JavaScript function, and this is called an event handler. In other words, we need to have a function that will execute whenever the event, the click event, has been generated by the user. So I'm going to go inside my component, and I'm going to create a function. So let's say const set, well, let's call it show message. So we're creating the function by using the arrow function technique. And we're going to use a JavaScript command called alert. And the purpose of alert is to simply display a message in a pop-up box. So the message we are going to display here is welcome to React. And I'm simply going to take the function name and I'm going to paste it inside the onClick event. So let's save. This button is the set me button. So I'm now going to click on the set me button. And there we have our pop-up. Message says, welcome to React. And what this tells us is that we have wired up the code properly. And we're actually seeing something being displayed. Now, if I change the message to I was clicked, and we save, then things get updated. And if I now click on the button, we're getting the message, I was clicked. So this proves to us that what occurred before was not a fluke. And we're now going to use this concept so that we can continue building out our solution. Instead of having an alert, we actually want to put information inside the text box. And in order to do this, as a first step, we need to bear in mind which property of the text box allows us to display information. And that is going to be the value property. So value equal, and let's hard code a value for now. So let's say that the value is going to be 25. So I'm going to save, and this indicates that we are able to use the value command to actually place some sort of value inside the text box. As was mentioned earlier though, this was hard coded by us as the developers. And what we want to have is whenever we click on the set me, then the value appears inside of that box. So we don't want to be hard coding the value at this point in our code. We actually want it to be set whenever we click on the set me button. Now, in order to get this to occur, we need to look at a concept known as a hook. And the hook is simply React's way of allowing us to extend the capabilities of our components. And there are different hooks that we have at our disposal. For example, we have a list here, and these are some of the common hooks. The tool that we will be making use of throughout this module extensively are going to be the first two, useState and useEffect. So I'll talk about the useState hook first. Whenever we want our component to be able to store values, internal values that it's going to use, then we make use of this hook known as useState. And whenever we talk about the state of a component, we're simply talking about the data that it currently has access to at this point in time. So in order to make use of the useState hook, we have to do some import. So let us import useState. And having imported useState, we now need to make use of this feature. So I'm going to go to the top of the component. So we're inside the component, and we are now going to set up the state for the component. In other words, what variables do we want to keep track of within this component? So the useState takes in two things. It takes in a variable. So let's call this variable text or input text. So input underscore text. And the other thing that it takes in is going to be a function name. So let's call this set input text. So the function name provides us with the ability to store a value inside the variable. So set input text will therefore allow us to store values inside of input text. And this has to be equal to useState. So this is like a function call. and we are going to pass in the data that we want to use to initialize the component, which in our case is going to be 0. All right. So the next step, having set up this component, we now want to make use of it. So I'm going to go to the show message. I'm going to get rid of our alert. And I'm going to make use of the function that allows us to set input text. It's going to be set input text. So remember, this is a function. So we're going to put in a value inside the function. So in this case, it's 105. I'm going to save. And what we have just done is we are telling the show message function, which has been associated with the onClick event. So remember, show message is going to be our event handler. And we have associated that with the click event or the onClick event. So whenever we click on the button, we are going to execute show message. What show message is going to do in this case, it's going to use the set input text function with the input of 105. And that 105 is then going to be stored inside the input text variable. We now need to make use of input text. So instead of having 25 inside the value being assigned to value, we're now going to assign input text. And we save. And as you look at our component, you realize that things are happening. We are seeing that the text box has now been initialized to 0. And this is happening because 0 is the value that we had indicated in our useState initialization phase. If I change that, let's change it from 0 to 15. Save. Notice once again that the state has been updated. The state of the text box. We are now showing that starting value, that initialization value of 15. I'm going to put it back to 0, but that's what we want our starting state to be. I save. And now we want to click on the Set Me button. Remember, Set Me is supposed to execute the show message function. And the show message function is going to place 105 into input text. So let's try that. Let's click on Set Me. And there we have it. The value 105 has been displayed. So by clicking on the Set Me button, we have now provided the functionality whereby we are able to interact with the text box and to put the value that we want to put into the text box, into it, whenever the button is clicked. All right, so we have wired up the first button. And now let us wire up the Sum Me button. So here's how we want this to work. We want to take whatever value is inside the text box, and we want to add a new value to that. So let's say I want to add 10 to what is currently stored inside the text box. So how do we go about accomplishing that? Well, we're still going to make use of our state. So let me create another function. So let's call this add me or add message. So this is a new function that we're going to create. And in this function, we're still going to use set input text, because what we are trying to do is to update the value inside the component. Now this command is going to look slightly different. Let me type it first, and then we can talk about it later. So we still talk about that code, but before we talk about it, let's wire it up. In other words, let's connect it to our second button. So this is our second button. So it's going to be onClick equal, and inside the curly brackets, we are going to put add message event handler. So add message. And let's save. So let's try that out first and foremost. So we have 105 being in the text box, and we want to add 10 to that. So we click on sum me. Notice that the value has changed from 110 to 115. Well, from 105 to 115. So let's go back now and talk about what is happening inside set input text. Remember, based on what we had said earlier, the way in which set input text work is that it's going to place a value inside the variable. Now, in the first instance, we pass in 105, so we are storing 105 into input text. That is with the show message. But when we are talking about add message, the code looks a little bit different. And here's what is happening. We're going to give it a variable. In this case, I'm calling the variable prev, short for previous. And what this variable will do is it will take the current value that is stored in the component and store it into prev. So it therefore means that since we were working with 105, then it means that 105 is now going to be stored inside of the variable prev. What we're then going to do is we're going to take that value, 105, and we're going to add the value 10 to it. So 105 plus 10 will give us 115. That 115 is now going to be used as the new input for set input text. In other words, it means we are now going to be storing 115 or passing 115 into set input text. And we already know that what this is going to do is it's going to take the 115 and it's going to store it inside the input text variable. And that is why we end up having our output saying 115. So going back from the start, if we reload so that it is 0, and we click on sum me, then notice it moves to 10, because 0 plus 10 gives us 10. If I change that value to 5, and I'll have to change it by making use of the initialization component. So I'm going to change it to 5. Then if I click on sum me, it's now going to update it to 15 because 10 plus 5 gives us 15. And there we go. We have effectively wired up our component. Some key points to bear in mind. We need to make use of the hook called useState whenever we want to manage the state of our component. In other words, whenever we want to be able to manipulate variables within the component, then we want to make use of the useState hook. The useState hook takes in two things. It takes in a variable and it takes in a function. The function is automatically going to be wired up so that it stores a value inside the variable. So we don't have to do the writing of the code for the function. In this case, it's called set input text. And just note, we can use variable names that we choose or names that we choose for each of these things. So for example, I could have called this, let's say X, and I could have called my function setX. So just making things clearer. And it therefore means that whenever I want to set a value into X, I would call setX. So it means I need to change to set X at both points. And ensure that we save. And we now need to change from the input text that we were using here to the variable that we are now using, which is X. And once we do that, then let's just test back the code. So click on sum me, goes from 5 to 15. Click on set me. Let me double check that one. Oh, yes, so 105. So the component is working just as it was working before. And that's it, in terms of wiring up the component. Of course, we can do more advanced stuff. So we'll be looking at additional use cases for the use state property. And we'll also be using that additional values that we can use to customize our JSX code. For example, notice that when I'm typing into the text box, nothing is happening. So what we can do to solve that or to resolve that is to make use of the onChange event. So I'll be looking at that in our next session. So use the information that you have now and start making changes to the React components that you would have created already. That's it for now. Take care.